Hey guys, I've got a 30-minute game up on the board with a player rated just under 1,000, so 950 in Rapid, and I'm going to use this as an example, a worked example of using the Goldfish method in a real game. So we have fairly standard king's pawn opening at e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. So we could find ourselves with the Italian game or the Re Lopez or two knights or Scotch. We'll see what my opponent chooses to do. Okay, so we've got two knights on the board. That's fine. Bishop hasn't come out yet. So I think I'm going to develop my bishop to c5. So what we can do in each go is say what's undefended and what's defending what. That's the first stage. So right now in my camp, the rook's obviously undefended at the start of the game. This bishop is technically undefended. And okay, so rook's defending the pawn, king's defending the pawn, king, queen and bishop are defending, queen's defending. So you can see this is the whole kind of map of what's defending what. So everything's currently quite well defended, apart from this bishop that's kind of out on its own, and the g7 pawn that it's just moved away from. So the bishop could be a target at this point, but I'm aware of what's undefended right now. You can pretty much ignore the idea of marking your rooks as undefended because they can usually look after themselves. Alright, so bishop has come out to b5 where it's attacking my knight. Okay, that's fine, the knight's defended twice. If the bishop chooses to capture, I've got a choice of pawns I can recapture with. And the question then is, if it does capture, I probably don't want to capture with the b pawn, it would probably be the d pawn, but that would mean capturing outwards with a pawn. I'm not sure I really want to do that. So one idea is maybe to play my other knight to e7 to add a third defender to that. Now that does come with a downside, which is that it will make life difficult for my queen to get out into the game. So what can we do? What's undefended on my opponent's side? That's defended. Okay, that's it. Really, just that rook and that pawn as well. So I'm expecting my opponent probably to castle kingside, but this does cause me a little bit of an issue. You know, if this bishop wants to go ahead and capture, what is my intention? If I push, say, d6, he captures, I capture with a pawn. That's not too bad, actually. I think I'm just going to push d6. So now this pawn is defended twice, so that's fine. The bishop is also defended once, which it wasn't before. And if bishop takes knight, I can recapture with my b pawn, opening up the b file maybe for my rook. But this has the advantage of, you know, pushing this pawn means that my bishop can now get out into the game, and I haven't tied up this knight here to defensive duties. So pawns move to here. What does that change on the board? Nothing really at all. Maybe planning to play b4, but that's fine, I'll just drop back. And still the rooks and this pawn are currently undefended. So I think clearly my next moves should be to develop my last two minor pieces. And the other thing that d6 did, it's enabled me to play bishop to d7, which is a pretty slow development move for a bishop, but it is getting off the back rank. It is allowing my rooks to connect. And then I can now move my knight out to f6, which is probably a preferable square than e7. And now if bishop takes, I can recapture with the bishop. So white really had one option there to take my knight and disturb my pawn structure. He didn't take it, he pushed a3 instead, and that's allowed me to add yet another defender. So I'm quite comfortable with this position right now. So now I want to develop my last knight and then think which side I want to castle on. Okay, so that the pawn is now attacking my bishop. So the question is, do I retreat the bishop to b6? Do I push forward to d4? It's an idea, because that would pin this knight against this rook. And also maintains, well, I suppose even back there it would still be on the same diagonal. Don't see any value really in swapping the bishop or the knight off for this pawn, but let's just think it through. It's always an option. No, I'd rather keep the bishop on the board. I don't see any mileage in that. If I put my bishop here, I think that's probably okay, because you see my dominant pawn structure is dark squared now, so that's going to leave this bishop somewhat out in the cold. And if I move to here and white decides to swap off their knight, it means my knight's in a lovely position on d4. I think that's probably an improvement from my perspective. So if knight takes, I can recapture with the knight. It means these two bishops are going to be facing off. I've got one minor piece left to develop, and so has white, and we've both still to castle, so everything's pretty even so far. Also notice that this knight is the defender, the only defender of that bishop. So if I capture that bishop somehow, its only defender is currently pinned against a rook. So what do we know about my opponent from Sweden? Hasn't played Blitz or Bullet, which is good to see. Rated 953 in Rapid. So this now poses a question. Also, if I capture the knight, then the d pawn's going to have to capture outwards, probably to recapture. And that may not be fantastic for white. So is white going to take the bait and capture the bishop? It's quite often quite nice to remove this defensive knight from the king side. Particularly if you anticipate your opponent castling kingside, then this knight does a crucial job of guarding that square. Okay, so we have bishop takes knight. That is interesting. Okay, so now let's draw the board again. Undefended, undefended. Technically undefended. It's defended and that's defended. Okay, so like knight's defending that, etc., etc., etc. Lots of defensive patterns going on here. So one thing I notice is that if I capture the bishop with my bishop, which is probably what I'm going to do, this pawn is technically undefended because the knight that is defending it is pinned against the rook. So I'm going to go ahead and capture there. Now my idea could be to capture the pawn, and the knight cannot retake because then I literally win the rook for free. And then my bishop can escape all the way back to where it came from. All right? So that's actually a target right now. And it's called capturing a piece whose defender is pinned. But now I can swap off the knight. I can capture the knight with my bishop. If white recaptures, I can then grab the pawn because its defender is off the board. So this is actually removing the defender. Very common tactic. Okay, so now I've got an option of grabbing that pawn because this pawn is now undefended, along with that one and that rook. Everything else on the board is defended. So what about my side of the board? King's defending that, bishop's defended, right, everything else is defended. So same kind of setup. And you'll notice that if you actually do this and you work through like a Grandmaster game, you'll spot very, very few undefended pieces because one of the things that they always make sure they do is trying to coordinate their pieces so that the pieces are defending each other. Right. There's no good reason not to capture the pawn. There's nothing really under threat. Bishop's attacking that, that's no trouble. So is the knight, that's fine. I'll go ahead and grab the pawn. So quite a simple tactical exchange there. I still haven't committed to whether I'm going to castle short or long. Okay, this is just one of those half-hearted attacks really. It's just kicking the bishop. So the question is, do I want to retreat down that diagonal or that diagonal? The bishop is actually the only defender of b7, so it would kind of make sense to drop back, say, to c6. That seems like a very flexible place for the bishop to be, and it's also keeping it on this diagonal now, because I'm anticipating, especially with b4 having come out, that this king's going to end up going that way. So I'm going to drop the bishop back down to c6. I don't have to worry about the pawn advancing because I've still got d5. I've got two comfortable squares for that bishop. Next, clearly I want to move my knight out into the board. I can come to one of two good squares. h6 doesn't seem to make any sense at this point. Okay, so white's castled. How does that change the board? That bishop is undefended. Rook's defending that, pawn's defending that, defending, 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 defending. Right, so it doesn't take long to colour in the defensive web. So white's now got only a dark squared bishop, and I've got this nice dark squared pawn structure, which is kind of nice. My bishop, however, is on the light squares and is already looking down towards black's king, which is cool. The queen is one of the two defenders of this knight on f3. Now, should this queen ever move away from the defense of the knight, then bishop takes knight becomes more appealing, because the only way for white to recapture would be with the g-pawn, and that would expose his king and double up his pawns. So one thing that you can infer from that, okay, so this is just a fact of life. The knight that I'm attacking is currently defended twice, right? To recapture with this pawn would be a bad thing. Okay, so right now if I was to capture that knight, we'd have queen takes, okay? So I've gained nothing from that. But if the queen should move, then capturing the knight means that only g2 can capture, and that would be better for me and worse for my opponent. So that then might raise the idea, how could we possibly encourage this queen to move away from the defense of the knight? Now I don't see an easy way of doing that right now. So I'm just going to complete development, I think about castling myself. I might even castle long in order to give myself some opportunities to start throwing my pawns up the board towards white, towards the king. That could make sense. And what is my opponent going to do? Okay, well, while we're thinking, what's undefended? 1, 2, that's it. Okay, same system, everything's kind of happy. So now let's say if I move my queen, I might castle, maybe put one of my rooks on g8. Okay, we've got another quiet move. So the purpose of this move is probably to protect the g4 square and prevent my knight from coming in. That's fine, I get that. Okay, so I think now it's simply a case of moving my queen. And I think d7, because if at any point, so I want to be looking at this pawn, right? And the reason is that pawn is defended by only that pawn. Now, if at any point I can get a rook onto the g file, then this pawn would actually be pinned. And then if queen takes h3, the g-pawn can't recapture. Now, this isn't on the board right now. I'm just laying possibilities for the future. That's all. So I think now I'm probably going to castle long. I'm not worried about my bishop. Okay, it's a curious move. I mean, centralising your rooks does often make sense. He still hasn't gotten his queen off the back rank. In fact, his queen's only got one other square where it can defend that knight. And then it's going to be in the way of the rook. Okay, let's go ahead and castle. So we have an undefended pawn on a7 and an undefended pawn on g7. Everything else on the board is defended. So I might choose to move my king to b8 at some point soon. But now this is good that my rooks are not undefended. They are now connected and looking after each other. So I have ideas of maybe moving my knight to d5, attacking this undefended bishop. Okay, what's undefended on black side? Just the bishop as far as I can see. Yeah. So pawn's defending that, king's defending those. Knight's defending the rook, technically. Rook and queen are defending each other. Rook and queen are defending each other. Queen's defending those. And rook's defending that, and that's defending that. Okay. And this bishop is undefended. So something like knight to d5 would be a forcing move, because the undefended bishop would then either need to get a defender or... Ooh, right, that's bold. That is a bold move. Okay, so let's see what's changed. Undefended pawn on h3. That's the defender of that. The queen is the only defender of the knight now, you see? A move ago there was another defender here, but now that defender is gone. So the knight only has one defender. Okay, these are all very, very simple facts that we just need to observe on the board. You're like Sherlock Holmes. You just look at what's in front of you and say what you see. Okay, so that to me then raises a possible idea. Let's say knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, queen takes check. Okay, you with me? So I capture with a knight, sack my knight. If pawn recaptures, queen recaptures with check, and now my queen is on this square, right? And what that means is that now my queen is attacking that knight as well as the king, and my bishop is attacking that knight. So I would have two attackers on there. So this is second level Goldfish, right? This is what the board is telling me, that we're not just saying like what's defending what, but if the queen was here, we'd have two attackers against one defender, and we'd have check. Okay, so let's go ahead and capture. And it looks like a sacrifice, but it isn't really a sacrifice. Because if pawn recaptures, then I capture with check and overwhelm against this guy. So it could actually finish the game quite soon. And you know, the information was right there. I mean, immediately when white played g4, I thought that looks rash. You don't generally want to weaken the pawns around your king, and this is weakening. This is from here. You see, we've gone from a situation where the king's defending two pawns, right? Okay, let's just finish that. So the king was defending two pawns. That pawn's got a defender. That knight's got two defenders. Okay. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 defensive arrows. Right here, that's defending that, that's defending that, that's defending that. We've gone from 5 defenses, to 5 defensive links or relationships, down to 3. Okay, so, right, my opponent has now unfortunately abandoned the game, but there we go. So I think, you know, with that coming up, I think let's just play on a little bit. So queen to here. So the king's now in check, and I've of course got two attackers on there. So where's the king going to go? It's got 1, 2, 3 scenarios. Okay. If the king goes into the corner, that's terrible because bishop takes knight, and we've got a fork. Okay, so that's winning. If the king goes, let's say here, might be the preferable one. Bishop takes knight, attacking the queen. Whatever the queen does, really, I've then got queen to g2, checkmate, because the bishop's covering that square and the queen's covering here. So that's no good and that's no good. If here, then probably still bishop takes, hitting the queen, and then wherever the queen goes, queen to g2 is going to be checkmate. So I think that was pretty much curtains for my opponent from that point. And it all came down to this one move, this weakening move, and then the ability to look 2 layers deep. Right, so if, and this is the key word in chess, if knight takes g4 and pawn takes, then queen takes. And it's just the ability to see that. So this is so we've got one attacker on here and one defender. Now what I notice is that this square, now, if I had a queen on it, would be looking at both the king with check, which is forcing, and looking at the knight. So knight takes, pawn, pawn takes, and queen takes. That is not above, out of the bounds of anyone's ability to visualize. You've just got to take the time first to map out the story of the board, what's going on the board. Now, really strong players can do this almost instinctively, right? And the reason they can do that almost instinctively is because they've practiced, they've slowed down, they've figured it out, and they've played lots of games, right? Now, for those of us who are trying to improve and become strong players, we need a bit of help. So the first thing that you need to do is give yourself the time so that you can slow down. You can map out the board, right? And then you can start saying, if I do that, what's going to happen? Oh, right, okay, yep. So there you go. I mean, it looked as though it was a very, very even game up until this point. And even so, you might look at this board and go, actually, white's all right here. You know, material is equal-ish. Black's up just one pawn. But in actual fact, this move is almost completely undoing white. So there you go. That's a worked example of using some of the Goldfish style of thinking, where you approach the board on each turn as though it's the first time you've seen it, as though it's a puzzle, and you are being presented with black to play. What's the solution? Right, now sometimes there won't be one, but in this case, black to play, yep, bang, all good. Okay, so there you go. If you haven't watched the Way of the Goldfish or Goldfish Level 2 videos, then you should probably go back and watch those, and this video will make a lot more sense. But I think it's simple enough that you should just be able to grasp the concepts pretty much straight away. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please do subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and I'll see you soon.